lights dim and the audience's conversations curtail as they eagerly wait for the play to begin. A loud bang rings through the expansive theater, and the audience gasps. However, the stage remains dark and unlit. The curtains lie motionless, dripping down to the floor like melting velvet ice cream. The show has not yet begun. That being as it is, then how come a shot rang through the theater? Because it was not a part of the act. The day following, the Sunday Weekly was published, listing details about what occurred that day. A shot rang through the Winston Chapel Theatre on the night of November 22nd, 1969, killing Herman McKinney, a medical worker at the Clayton Hospital on 24th Street. According to Catherine McKinney, Herman's wife, who was sitting beside him when the accident occurred, the bullet hit him in the chest, and she knew right away that there was no hope. When the ambulance arrived, she appeared to be correct. The bullet killed him within minutes, and there was in fact no hope for the doctor. Officer Andy Smith saw a man fleeing the scene and immediately raced after the figure with his partner, George Bennett. They chased the figure down to the corner of Main and 25th Street. Andy and his partner saw the man for the briefest of moments, but they both described him as follows: dark green eyes, the color of jungle vines, wavy chocolate brown hair, and an oddly shaped scar on his forehead. He was last wearing a dark black coat with muddy brown boots. Report this figure immediately if seen, and report any suspicious behavior to the authorities. Police are currently investigating the case with a professional. Officer Andy Smith, Officer George Bennett, their commanding officer, and a detective known as Professor Brown all sat in a large chamber. Andy Smith was accustomed to working with detectives, but this one was different. Professor Brown, as the detective was known, gave him an indescribable feeling. He seemed so familiar, yet he could not put his finger on why. Had they met before? He claimed to be following the perpetrator of these violent acts that had been occurring in other locations throughout the state. The killer would attempt to murder someone in the theater. Attempt? Apparently, this was the first time the murderer had actually succeeded in his violent acts. Professor Brown walked into the office the morning following the incident. He claimed to know about the case and then proceeded to explain to Andy, George, and their commanding officer all that he knew concerning the Phantom of the Opera as the criminal became known. When Professor Brown was finished explaining this case, he adjusted his hat and asked Andy, George, and the chief officer what had occurred that night, and that he wished to see evidence that may lead to the perpetrator, Officer Smith. "Please call me Andy," Andy insisted. "All right then," the professor agreed. "Andy, if I am not mistaken, you were there when this incident happened, correct?" "Well, yes," Andy replied. "I was there. George and I chased the criminal down to the corner of 25th and Main until we lost him. He ran into the abandoned pickle factory on the corner. We followed him in, but he just disappeared." Professor Brown trailed off. Do you have any evidence that I may examine? Indeed, we do, sir. The chief officer walked off into another room and returned with a couple of Ziploc bags. Inside were pieces of documentation of which the professor would examine. We hope this prove useful to the investigation of your professor. I am sure they will, said the professor. He opened the bag labeled 102377A and peered inside. He pulled out a tiny bullet covered in dry blood. Is this the bullet that killed Mr. McKinney? Yes, said George. Because of the blood, we haven't been able to match it to any specific person or gun. He walked forward and looked closely at the bullet. I personally think the Phantom would have just used a regular pistol. Professor Brown nodded. I would agree with that, Mr. Bennett. He peered at the bullet, almost squinting his eyes. Yes, indeed. I would also conclude that this bullet was fired by a pistol. They all stood there in silence until the commander said, we should leave you to look over the evidence. We wouldn't want to disturb you, Andy. Andy, George, and their chief then left the room, leaving Professor Brown alone to work. When the door was fully shut, the commander said to George and Andy to do anything the professor told them. They nodded, and the chief walked off. Andy still couldn't find out what it was with Professor Brown. He seemed so strange, so familiar. It was on the top of his tongue. What was it, George? Andy whispered. George looked over, and Andy continued. Doesn't the professor seem strange to you? Familiar, maybe? Andy looked away. I don't know. I just have this feeling. Andy, when was your gut ever been right? George joked. Andy wanted to laugh, but just couldn't. This was serious, but apparently George didn't think so. Andy decided that George was probably right. When has his gut ever been right? His thoughts were interrupted by Professor Brown opening the door. He walked out, carrying a handful of files, looking like a busy businessman. So you traced the DNA back to these three suspects, correct? He dug out 3 papers from his towering stack and pinned them to the bulletin board on the wall that was behind the desk. Each paper had a picture and a name. The first read Suzanne Jacobs and had on it a picture of a 30 or so year old lady with frizzy orange hair and bright blue eyes, the color of clean ocean water. She had on an elegant black hat with pure white feathers popping out from the right side. On the second paper was the name Thomas Banks, and on it was also the picture of a young boy who could be no older than 7, who looked like he still slept in a reserve bed. He had blonde hair that was slightly messy and blue eyes that seemed to bulge oddly out of his head. The final paper had the name Lucy Wright on it and had the picture of a 20-ish-year-old woman who wore a fancy black dress. She had brown hair, brown eyes, and had on a graceful necklace with a tiny gem in the center. Well, responded George, we did come up with those people, but you left out Winfred Nobel and Herman McKinney. He searched the stack of papers for a moment or two, before pulling out two sheets of paper that were similar to the others, a name and a photograph. One had the name Winfred Nobel and other Herman McKinney. However, the latter, unlike the rest, had the word deceased in the corner, as Herman McKinney had passed on. The picture of Mr. Nobel was of an elder man, perhaps in his late 40s, who had brown hair with grays sprouting up there. He had on a suit and a tie, and he had hazel-colored eyes, the color of a caramel. "My apologies," spoke the professor. "I trust that you have spoken with these suspects." "Indeed, we have, sir. None of them had any information concerning the case," said Andy. He then added, "And the little boy was so frightened, so we didn't ask him many questions. He isn't a suspect, but he may have some information we need." "Would it be possible," the professor asked, "for me, myself, to question these people?" Clearly, Professor Brown was wanting for more information to inspect. "Well, I supposed so," George said uncertainly. The professor nodded. "Okay then, let's go." Andy, George, and Professor Brown tracked down all of the suspects, starting with Thomas Banks. "Son, could you tell me what happened that night?" the professor questioned. He shifted his feet nervously. "Well, I was with Mommy and Daddy, and we were going to see a show. The lights got darker. The Mommy whispered to me that the show was starting, and everyone got quiet. Then I heard a gunshot and started to cry. Just a bit though. Mommy told me that it was okay, and it was just part of the show. I calmed down. There were few screams and Daddy started to get nervous. I told him it was just part of the show to calm him down too, but he was still scared. Then we found out that someone had actually died. It's sad." "It is sad," Andy said, looking down. Professor Brown thought for a moment, then asked, "Can you tell me where you had been before that?" Thomas thought for a moment, then said, "Oh, I went to the bathroom about 10 minutes before the show. I got kind of lost and ended up in a weird room with a bunch of chairs and tables and stuff like that stacked up in stakes." "Interesting. Thank you, Thomas." The professor puzzled for a moment and then left the room. The others also said somewhat the same things. Lucy Wright said, "I had gotten lost when I was walking into the theater and wound up in a storage room full of furniture boxes." The same was with Suzanne Jacobs. "I had lost my reading glasses right before the play began, and I went to look for them in a storage room sort of place. And when I came back, a man had been murdered." Winfred Nobel also said the same thing. "I was looking for the restroom and became lost. I instead found a large storage room filled with furniture boxes and other items." Andy, George, and the professor met up in another room to analyze the information. "You have checked the security footage, right?" "Yes, sir," George responded. "There were nothing much." "Well," said the professor, "let's check again." They took him to the theater and asked to see the security footage of the storage room. The suspect had described from the night of the 22nd. As Andy had said, there was nothing but static. "See." Andy began to walk off. "Wait!" cried the professor. Look at this. Andy whirled around and saw actual camera footage. This is impossible, he murmured, shocked. We watched the whole footage and there was nothing. He trailed off, millions of thoughts flying through his head. How is this possible? His questions had no answers. His thoughts, no conclusions. Professor Brown suggested maybe the cameras were malfunctioning then. Perhaps they just needed time. It was reasonable, so Andy agreed. They saw Thomas venture into the room, his face wet with tears, calling for his parents. Later, they saw Mr. Jacob walks into the room, looking for his glasses. But he left empty-handed. Later still, they saw Miss Wright peek in the room and walk around in it for a minute, then leave. However, they saw no sign of Winfred Nobel. Well done, Professor. Andy said, you have caught the Phantom of the Opera. The three then walked out of the Winston Chapel Theatre to report their findings. They had been able to receive a search warrant and knocked on the door of Winfred Nobel. They searched his house and found even more evidence. Andy strode over to the Professor Brown. You know, he said, I had my doubts about you, but you have truly proven yourself. Good job, Professor. And he meant every word. Mr. Nobel, Professor Brown questioned, is it true that you were out of the town on the 3rd of October just last month? Yes, sir, Winfred replied. I was visiting family. Where did you travel to? The professor asked. I went to Pineville, West Virginia. Interesting, the professor went on, because that is exactly where another murder was attempted. Winfred's countenance was full of shock. His eyes instantly grew double their size. He was terrified. No, it wasn't me. Here, shouted another officer. He held up a pistol found under Winfred's mattress. Just as I suspected, said Professor Brown, gently picking up the pistol from the officer's hands. Now, Mr. Nobel, if you don't mind revealing your forehead. Winfred nervously brushed aside some of his short wavy hair to reveal, as suspected, a scar. A scar that both Andy and George had testified to seeing on the criminal's forehead. The newspapers said to look out for a man with green eyes, wavy dark brown hair, and a scar on his forehead. Mr. Nobel had all of that, and even the black coat, the muddy boots, and a pistol he tried to hide under his mattress. He had committed the crime, and now he would face the consequences. No, I didn't. I would not, he pleaded, because I did nothing wrong. Several officers dragged him away as he tried desperately to argue his innocence, but he was grasping at straws. Shortly after Winfred had been taken away, everyone had left the room. Everyone except for George, Andy, and the professor. You know, I had my doubts about you, Professor, George said. I didn't want to admit it. Now, though, you have clearly proven yourself. You caught the Phantom of the Opera. Well done. George walked off to meet with the other officers, but Andy stayed behind, saying he would catch up later. Is something bothering you, Andy? Professor Brown asked. Yes, there is. Andy looked up and made eye contact with the professor, who was adjusting his hat. My mother lives in Pineville, and her birthday is in fact in October. I went to visit her on October 1st. Andy paused. Mr. Brown, I have reason to believe that You are lying. Andy took a step forward. Am I correct, Professor? Andy could see evil in his eyes. He made a move to run. But it was too late. Mr. Brown took the pistol that was found under the mattress and fired, leaving Officer Smith lying on the ground. He put the gun on the ever still chest of the dead officer and took off his hat, revealing an oddly shaped scar on his forehead. He shied. Well, that was dramatic.